what we're going to do tonight, following up from last week. The last week especially, we really focused on the nature of Christ. Who is Jesus Christ? What is his nature? And this evening, we're going to look at the work of Christ. What has Christ done? Is this, sorry?
3, she says.
This is the third?
Third, yes, I have a third.
Okay. All right. Well, anyway, so we are going to talk about topics that we know well, and yet there are certain questions that we just assume have been answered and maybe haven't really thought about. For example, what did Christ actually accomplish for us? Well, of course, the first answer is, well, he saved us. But what does that mean exactly? What is salvation? What has Jesus saved us from? What has Jesus saved us to?
Yeah.
Or for, right? So these are actually really good questions to think about, and we're going to try to do that some tonight. And what we'll do is look at some scriptures that describe the work of Christ, and then we'll look at a few of the church fathers. We're really just going to hit a few examples because this goes way deep. Let me tell you, the material that we could get into is really vast. But this is not a course on patristics, so
Darn.
Yeah, well, it kind of is, but anyway, we will look at some representative samples. So, first set of questions. We'll look at the word atonement in just a second. This is the word that we use to refer to the work of Christ, what Christ has done. So in the atonement, what is God doing? And in the atonement, what is Jesus doing as a human being? So in his human nature. So we've been talking about recently, the word became flesh. This is the nature of Christ, right? He's fully divine and fully human. We touched on this topic in the study we did in the fall, and we'll come back to that topic eventually and maybe cover it from a different angle. So we know that Christ has this two nature reality, divine and human, one person, two natures. In his, as a human being, what is it that Jesus did on our behalf that saves us? Right away, we could think of dying on the cross, rising from the dead. Is there anything else? What does it all mean? These are the kinds of questions we're going to touch on. All right, so a definition of atonement. And surprisingly enough, I'm taking this definition, which is quite extensive itself, from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And if you want to kind of nerd out sometime, you can just, this is a free encyclopedia online. And you can go online and you just Google Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, type in your search term and see what you get. So there's a quite extensive article on atonement. And so the generic definition of atonement, you can see there on the screen: to do something to repair a relationship fractured by wrongdoing. This is very, very basic. It then goes to kind of flesh out that definition, looking at these 5 different categories. All these words relate to atonement. So reconciliation, that's pretty straightforward. Forgiveness, sacrifice. So from forgiveness to sacrifice in relation to God, God is the one who forgives, right? The human, this is still generic, right? In the Old Testament, for example, there's something called a guilt offering, where the worshiper sacrifices an animal as a guilt offering. So the idea of sacrifice, and of course, today, there's no animal sacrifice in Judaism. So on the Day of Atonement, when sacrifice historically was made, Jewish people, observant Jewish people today will do something on the Day of Atonement that is some kind of personal good deed, sacrifice, to put it kind of lamely, something that inconveniences them for the good of someone else. So you can kind of get a feel for sacrifice in a modern sense that way. And then these two words that have created some translation controversy in the New Testament over the years. Propitiation. And I'll get to expiation in a minute. They don't mean exactly the same thing. They're not 100% interchangeable, but there's a lot of overlap. So propitiation means to appease or to conciliate the one who is wronged. So now, if God is the one who needs to be propitiated, the worshiper needs to do something to appease God, right? So we could think, and you can start to see how these terms relate to one another and overlap. We could think of confessing our sin. Honestly admitting our sin to God would be, at least partially, a way of propitiating God. And then God could forgive, right? That would be God's action in this process. Now, the word expiation, you can see they come from the same root, but the oh golly, Steve, prefix, there's the word I was looking for, is different. X is the idea of from out of, right? So different ways of thinking about it, but some New Testament versions use the word propitiation to refer to God's wrath is addressed, right? It's God's wrath that is propitiated. Some use the word expiation, and of course, a lot of versions don't use either of these words now. Like my version, the New Revised Standard that I use most often, uses the word atoning sacrifice. So it might be something like that. But the Revised Standard Version from way back in the day that I kind of grew up with when I was a kid used the word expiation. My New American Standard Version uses the word propitiation. So the idea of expiation has a little bit of the connotation of drawing something out of the worshiper, like to draw out sin. Atonement expiates, draws out the sin, right? So there, propitiate kind of focuses on God, expiate kind of focuses on what's happening in the human. These are all connected to atonement, so let's keep that in mind. And then finally, satisfaction, which means to pay a debt. You satisfy a debt. But in this case, we're talking about a moral debt, right? A debt that we owe to God, or to pay a debt to satisfy the value of the impact on the one wrong. So, Psalm 51, David prays, against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. There's a sense in which all sin is sin against God. Okay, let me stop. Questions, observations about these words, because atonement is what we're talking about tonight. The work of Christ generally is understood under the umbrella term of atonement. So, yeah.
It just dawned on me that we don't talk about atoning for our own sins ever. And maybe that's because, maybe we can't, but I don't know. I was thinking, as you were giving the definition of these words, I was thinking about just human to human relationships.
Right.
And, that is not, those things aren't just human to God or human to Jesus issues. They're
right.
human to human.
Right.
So is it a Christian's responsibility to in some way atone the wrongs that they do to each other?
Right. So this is where these words start to overlap, right? So here, satisfaction comes into the picture. So let's say I've offended you, I've wronged you. What do I need to do? I need to confess to you that I recognize I've wronged you. I need to ask for your forgiveness. And to the extent that I am able to do so, I need to make amendments. I need to amend my life so that I don't do it again, or I need to do something to satisfy your sense of the injustice. Yeah.
We
So
just don't talk about that
we
in
don't-
Christian circles. Atonement is something that belongs to God.
right. Yeah. Yeah. And of course the gospel has taught us that there's really nothing we can do in our own strength, out of our own resources, to atone with God, right? This is obviously why we need a mediator. We need someone to atone for us. But yeah, there's a way in human relationships, these words all work, but you're right, we don't use them very much. We can apologize, we can forgive, we have a fairly small list of words that we can use.
But even sacrifice, sometimes when you have to confess that you're wrong, in essence, it is a sacrifice to your own.
Yeah, you're sacrificing your own ego there, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so these words help us begin to think about what Christ is doing for us. And then what does he achieve, right? What does he accomplish? Well, we can think of things like forgiveness, right? Reconciliation with God. And we could talk about other things here, but just from this list, we can see some of what Christ does for us. All right. Couldn't God have just done it some other way? Has
Yes.
anybody ever mentioned that question in your presence?
Oh, yeah.
If we answer yes to the question, why is atonement necessary with God now? We're going to really focus on the divine human relationship. If we believe that atonement really is necessary, then why? We can just brainstorm popcorn here for a minute or two. How would you answer that question?
Justice?
Yeah.
Okay, say more.
It's not just for someone who's earned a punishment to escape it. That's something else. I'm not saying that isn't a God attribute necessarily, but it's just if we're just looking at justice for a person who's been wronged,
Yeah.
it doesn't just go away.
Okay.
There's been some harm.
There's harm. Yeah.
So how do you make up for that?
Right. How do you rectify the harm done? Right. How do you? Okay. Well,
Does
but
it
God.
keep us in line?
To keep us there.
Say again, Larry. Sorry.
Does it keep us in line?
The idea of justice, the requirement of justice, is that what?
Right.
Yeah. So what I'm now all of a sudden I'm thinking like a teenage boy, right? I know if I do X, Y, or Z and my parents find out, I'm really going to get it when I get home.
Okay.
If that's kind of analogous to justice, then it may keep me from doing X, Y, or Z, right? Because I don't want to face.
The wrath of.
Does that kind of go with what you're thinking, Larry Swanson?
Well, yes, in a way, but in everyday old age life,
Okay, yeah.
I'm still kept in line.
Oh, yeah, good point. Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Okay, well, what
can do
about, well, God's
Okay,
loving,
yeah,
right? God's
right.
loving, so why can't he just forgive? Right? Why not?
that.
Nothing's
No,
required of
it
us as
seems
a
large.
result.
I'm sorry, say again, Larry.
I said nothing is required of us as a result of that.
Yeah, why does anything need to be required of
Yeah.
us?
Well, it's a relationship.
Ah, okay. So it needs to be two-way, right?
Yeah, yeah,
The truth is, we kind of already act like God just makes the problem go away.
yeah, yeah.
You know, we cut corners knowing that we shouldn't, but you
Yeah.
know, God is just gonna make that go away because he's forgiving and we,
He's gracious, generous.
yeah.
Yeah.
We know we do wrong, we do it anyway, not even fearing
Yeah.
in any retribution.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons this question might be difficult, at least for some people, maybe not this group, maybe it is in some ways, but I think this is an example of how we don't take ourselves seriously enough. Nothing really matters that much, you know, except the things we really care about, right?
Mhm.
But otherwise, nothing really matters that much. So what I do or don't do doesn't really matter that much. God's a nice guy, so he doesn't think it really matters that much. You know, I'm obviously I'm saying this in a very clumsy way, but I do believe this is a fairly common attitude that we don't, and partly the reason for our not taking ourselves seriously enough is that we don't spend enough time thinking about what it means to be created in God's image. We tend to emphasize the dignity side of that, maybe not so much the responsibility side of it.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't
Anyway,
think
go ahead.
I just was going to say, I don't think we think about the person that might be affected.
Yeah.
You know,
we
it's
just
so what? So what? I get
Right.
it.
Right. We just
I
want to
think
move
so.
on.
Uh-huh.
All right. Well, we're really focusing on the work of Christ and this isn't really not exploring the doctrine of human sinfulness and all that, but it's obviously closely related to what we are talking about. So let's now start looking at some of the scriptures that describe the atonement and what Jesus is doing. This is a pretty healthy list, but not by any means all that we could look at. So start with Matthew 20:28. Just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. This is also in Mark 10, verse 45, really the same words. So we have his life and we have ransom. So when you hear the word ransom, what do you think of?
Kidnapping.
Kidnapping, okay.
Too.
So there's a price paid to get somebody back, okay?
Right.
Redeemed or redemption. Yep. In the Old Testament, the notion of the kinsman redeemer we see in the book of Ruth. Life. He gives his life as a ransom for many. Go ahead.
Well, the ransom for many part had to have been part of the argument of his deity, of the deity of Jesus. because of the argument that one human being cannot ransom, the life of one
yeah.
human being cannot ransom many.
Right, okay. Except that, is God dying? Is God dying to give his life?
Yeah.
The correct answer is no. This is fine. That's another matter, but yeah, I mean, unless don't understand what you're driving at.
Well, it's just that, you know, when people argued that Jesus had to have been, he could not have been simply a man, because simply a man can't really ransom, one life cannot ransom many.
Okay,
I don't know.
I mean, you know, seriously, Jesus' life is one life.
Mhm. But that's why it had to be also divine.
Yeah.
A divine life.
Okay.
Well, okay, wait. Perspective.
Yeah.
In the Old Testament,
Uh-huh.
pre-Christ, but it points to Christ, was the perfect lamb.
Mhm.
That one life had to be done annually,
Mhm.
but that's what was
True.
given for the redemption.
Uh-huh.
So that one lamb could be for family, whatever.
For the whole nation.
Okay.
Well, but don't give up too easily on that, because this all points toward the reason why the church in these early controversies of the first 3 or 4 centuries, why they just kept working back and forth over these things. And it's why when we get to Chalcedon, you do have fully divine, fully human in one person. So
That is, yeah, so.
there is a sense in which God participates directly in this scenario. Okay, well, John 8:34 through 36. And I just put these scripture texts more or less in order as they're found in the New Testament canon. So the themes that we're hitting, the motifs, will jump back and forth a little bit. All right. John 8:34 through 36. Jesus answered them, "Very truly I tell you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not have a permanent place in the household. The son has a place there forever. So if the son makes you free, you will be free indeed." So along with the idea of ransom, or you might say part of the idea of ransom, we could fit this idea of slavery to sin. Like we're trapped in something we can't get out of. And so somebody else more powerful has to do something about that. 1 Corinthians 6:20. For you, and this is second person plural, y'all, or yeah, use guys, you guys. For you were bought with a price, therefore glorify God in your body. And, you know, reading in the context of this book, the price is Christ and him crucified. Paul says, I determined to know nothing among you but Christ and him crucified. So that most likely is the price that Paul has in mind when he says you were bought with a price. Again, we have the idea of ransom here. 2 Corinthians 5:21.
I made him who had no sin to be sin for us.
Right.
So in
For-
him we
for-
might become the righteousness of God.
Yeah. Again, we have atonement in mind here. What is Christ doing to atone? And we're getting a kind of multi-dimensional picture about what Christ is doing in atonement. Here, for our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. I mean, it's mind-blowing.
Yes.
Mhm.
But the idea of him becoming sin. Now, we have to be careful here because Paul is not saying that Jesus himself is sinful.
It's just a
Remember from,
substitute. He's a
yeah,
substitute. Yeah.
Hebrews 4, tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. So it's he receives in being sin, sort of representative human being now, he receives the just penalty of the law so that we might become, there's the exchange that happens. This is part of what Christ accomplishes.
This phrase, and I know it's in Romans on the left, the righteousness of God, so that we might become the righteousness of God.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I'm not sure what Paul has, what he's really driving at in, because he does use the righteousness of God in Romans to refer to the righteousness of God, this kind of faithful,
Circular.
covenant keeping God. He's, steadfast love.
Correctness.
Yep, yep,
In fact, he defines righteousness as covenant faithfulness.
right.
In fact, if you read that, and substitute covenant faithfulness, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the covenant faithfulness of God. So we become the thing that God promised Abraham,
Yeah,
the people of God,
yeah. So the community of followers of Jesus becomes collectively a righteous image, representation, manifestation, testimony of God's righteousness.
what God
Right.
promised and did.
Yeah,
Is this where the notion of penal substitution comes from?
it's a little clearer in other places, but this is one of the things about these theories of the atonement. They are not mutually exclusive, and I've got one example where like verses right next to each other in the same book show two different theories of atonement, but they're clearly part of the same work of Christ. All right,
Steve,
Galatians.
could Paul have had in mind about us becoming the righteousness of God? It makes me the way you explained it makes me think back about the purpose of Israel in the first place, that we were God's representatives on
Right.
earth, and everybody would see how we act and therefore want to emulate us. Is
Right.
that too far of a stretch?
No, I don't think so at all. I think it's very much, it's not the only thing there, but
Right.
it certainly is part of the, for lack of a better way of saying it, of the concept there having to do with righteousness.
Okay.
The picture, yeah. All right, Galatians 3:13. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law, for it is written.
By becoming a curse.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, by becoming a curse for us. Thank you. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. Now that's a direct quotation from Deuteronomy chapter 21. And it has to do with the Jewish understanding of crucifixion in part, right? That for people to be hung on a Roman cross was the same thing as being hung on a tree. And so here in Galatians, Paul explicitly says that Christ receives the curse, the judgment that is due us. Now here we get, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but we get the idea of substitution.
Mhm.
And we also get the idea of satisfaction. Christ does for us what we're not really able to do for ourselves. He
Right.
meets the just requirement of the law in receiving the just judgment of the law, right? He is paying the price. Just facets of a very multifaceted picture of the atonement in the New Testament. Now, Philippians 2:8. Tiny bit of 7. And being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So, what is God doing? What is the human doing, right? So, Jesus Christ, in his human nature, is obeying God to the point of death. Now, that raises all kinds of topics and thoughts, right? But the point here is obedience, right? He humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, like all the way in. I'm giving my life as a ransom for many. There's a sense of what life involves here.
But that kind of confuses me too. It's like, you're obedient to the wishes of God, and yet you die as a result, or you're put on a cross as a result of your obedience. Is that right?
Yeah, well, that is right, and it forces the question, well, why? What
Yeah,
what is going on here? Why if Jesus is, if I could put this in words in a way that I think I hear you asking, why if Jesus does it the right way,
yeah.
if he's obedient to God, then why does he get the punishment, right? Well,
That's what
because
it seems like. What the way I read it, that's exactly what I was thinking.
yeah. Well,
That's the point, isn't it?
this is, he does it for us.
Right.
Right? He does it for us. He is taking our place. He is satisfying justice for us. He is paying the ransom price. Yeah. Okay,
Oh,
Colossians
okay.
2,
That makes
13 and
sense.
14.
That's why when people say, that what do they call God a father who is abusing his child by,
Yeah,
that's why it's important to recognize that Jesus did that of his own will.
right.
Yeah.
He's fully invested in this plan.
Yeah, he's not doing it because God is just lashing out.
Right.
Yeah, I guess I just put it together. It's like it's not as if he has to obey the law. He has to follow God's wishes, which essentially is the same thing, but it's not like a commandment or in Deuteronomy or whatever. He's being obedient, he's all in, and he knew that this was going to happen. Okay, that
Right.
makes sense.
Yeah.
That was the
And
point
that-
I was going to make.
Yeah.
Jesus knew this was going to happen before he ever came to earth.
Yeah,
I mean, this was his mission.
he understood it. Yeah.
And that's why that Philippians 2 passage is sometimes referred to as a hymn or a poem, right? Who, though he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited or held on to,
Right.
but he emptied himself. So here is the divine eternal Son taking on human nature for this very purpose, to break the power of sin over humanity. All right, Colossians 2, 13 and 14. We'll start with a little bit of, 13 and 14. And when you were dead in trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive together with him when he forgave us all our trespasses, erasing the record that stood against us with its legal demands. So when we're going to get to these theological terms in a second, but here I could mention the judicial understanding of the atonement or the penal substitutionary understanding of the atonement. Christ's action erases the record against us. Well, how does he do that? Well, he does it by dying, but also by obeying, right? It's not only his death on the cross. And then one more, 1 Timothy 2:5. For there is one God, there's also one mediator between God and humankind, Christ Jesus, himself human, who gave himself a ransom for all. So, you know, that word ransom shows up there, but clearly Jesus, as a human being, atones. So there's divine action, there's human action involved here. Okay. The terms we're going to look at tonight, and there are different ways of slicing up this pie, right? But we're going to use these terms for what Christ accomplishes. And I put in parentheses there, as the God-man. So there's both divine and human action. The scholars, the thinkers across the centuries have teased out these distinctions to try to identify as much as we can what goes where. And we're not going to be that precise tonight, but hopefully we'll get a good idea of what these words mean. So ransom, we've run across, and I put the word victory there. So Christ is victorious over the devil, sin, the powers that harm, that distort, that falsify. Christ, in his life, death, and resurrection, is victorious, and that victory is made available to anyone who will believe in Christ. So ransom and victory are they're not exactly the same thing, but they're close. So you might say ransom is the price paid, and the outcome is liberation, freedom from the power of sin. That's where the victory shows up, right? Now we have to, I should have said this earlier, but it's very, very good and important for us to kind of keep in mind, we're talking not just about individual people. We're really talking about Christ dying for the human race. Now that raises other questions, of course, but Christ, this is a human race kind of problem. And these pictures in the New Testament are a human race kind of scope that we have in mind. So victory over the power of evil, the devil, sin.
The things that hold us captive.
Right.
That's why you need to be ransomed.
Right. The things that's good. The things that hold us captive. Okay.
And he also, Paul in the Colossians text, he's very specific. I think it's specific. You were dead in your sins and in the uncircumcision of your sinful nature.
Right.
God made you alive.
Right.
So it's all, but it's also personal.
Well, here, yeah, he's addressing the Colossians, so he's talking to Christians when he says God made you alive, right? It's not just an automatic. Everybody gets yeah. And Paul says this in Ephesians too. You were dead in your trespasses and sins, walking according to the prince of the power of the air, etc.
You are probably use guys.
Yeah, it's second person plural.
Yeah,
that's right.
You know,
Right.
You all.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to combine these next two bullets here, penal substitution with judicial or forensic. And these are, again, these are some of the technical terms that theologians use to talk about these things. So judicial, forensic, now we're talking about the law. And so human beings, the angle on the human problem here is we are lawbreakers, right? So we've moved away from the idea that we're subject to these spiritual powers that control and dominate us. That's part of the picture. But we're also guilty, rebellious lawbreakers. We're criminals who, in this sense, have committed the ultimate crime. And so there's the concept of law, justice, guilt, forgiveness, punishment. Got those backwards. Punishment, forgiveness. So punishment is related to the penal substitution, right? Christ is receiving in the atonement the punishment, the judgment that should come to us. So we have law and, you know, penalty, and we have the powers. We have a different kind of condition, not just guilty lawbreakers, but people who are prisoners to the evil powers, to sin, to Satan. Okay, the last one then is called recapitulation, and I've been having a lot of fun with this one, which is a silly way to say it, but recapitulation is the one that we know the least probably. So we're going to look at it, and I'll explain it in the following way. Okay, first with ransom. Now what I'm doing is I want to combine some of the scriptures we've looked at with an observation from one of the church fathers. And I could have done many of these, but we just don't have the time. So I picked out a few just to give us a sampling. So Origen, you know, highly educated from Alexandria, wound up in Palestine, suffered for his faith, was brutally persecuted, and died. He didn't die at the hands of executioners, but he was so badly broken in his body after they tortured him that he eventually died of complications. So you know, it's good to keep these things in mind, because these are not just abstract theological debates that a bunch of academics are having. These are guys who are giving their lives. And here's what he says. This is related to the ransom idea. Now it was the devil that held us, to whose side we had been drawn away by our sins. And now we are enslaved to sin and the devil. So we read these scriptures, but there's one we didn't look at. Well, we didn't read Hebrews 2:14, so let's go there. Hebrews 2:14. Since therefore the children share flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared the same things, so that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death. So here's the idea of ransom. What Christ accomplishes in the atonement is he frees us from these powers. Colossians 2:15. Now we had just looked at Colossians, and this is the other part of it I wanted us to notice. So 2:15 is more along the lines of this ransom or the victory idea. This guy in the early 20th century wrote a book called Christus Victor. So Christ the victor. And that's now kind of a common way of referring. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and made a public example of them, triumphing over them in it, right? Now, so we have in 13 and 14 one angle on the atonement, you might say, erasing the record, right? And then right next to it, we have this other angle on the atonement that has more to do with principalities and powers. So the idea of justice and law, he's answered that question, addressed that concern, and now he's freeing us from the power of the rulers of this
And
world.
also this speaks to, and the Colossians didn't have, well, they still were an honor shame culture, I guess, to some degree, but the
Yeah.
public spectacle,
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah,
shame,
right.
Christ.
Yeah. Now, here's one of the really amazing things that I just think about how the power of God is manifested in this. So he disarmed the rulers and authorities, and we are talking about the Caesars of the world. He disarmed them by dying, by receiving. He disarmed them by receiving the worst they could do. So their manifestation of power is, we can kill you. And they did. And Jesus' manifestation of power is, yeah, you can kill me, but death doesn't get the last word, you know? And you can kill me only because I'm allowing it. Okay, we'll go on. Oh, now for the satisfaction idea, right? The payment of a right to
Satisfy a debt.
satisfy a debt. Now, if you get into this discussion, you'll find theologians who insist that the satisfaction idea doesn't show up until Anselm in the 11th century. But I read an article that really unpacks these early church fathers who, even though they may not use the word satisfy or satisfaction, the way they describe the atonement clearly fits with this satisfaction idea. And here we have an example of it from Ambrose of Milan. Ambrose, you can see his date there, Milan, obviously Italy. He was very influential in St. Augustine's coming to full faith in Christ. Okay, so this is what Anselm said. Jesus took flesh that he might destroy the curse of sinful flesh, and he became for us a curse, that a blessing might overwhelm a curse, uprightness might overwhelm sin, forgiveness might overwhelm the sentence, and life might overwhelm death. So in a way, we can say this is more than satisfaction, right? It's overwhelming these problems. But, and, implicit in this one statement, we could find ransom in there, we could find substitution, we can find, but it's the idea that what Christ does satisfies the requirements of the law, of God's holiness, of the problem of life and death.
It even has an element of victory because of the use of overwhelm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right,
Overwhelm.
right. Okay, so that's satisfaction. So this is it's like another little facet in the diamond of atonement, right? We don't have to pick one of these over the other. In fact, we shouldn't do that because these are all scriptural and they help us to grasp all that Christ has done for us. Recapitulation. Okay, this is one of those words that in English has changed its meaning. So when we hear the word recapitulate, we think summary, just give me the bullet point executive summary. I'm going to tell you what's in this article by recapitulating the high points. And that's true, but it doesn't go quite as far as what the original Greek wording refers to. So our word recapitulation comes from the Latin, recapitulatio, right? So directly from the Latin. The Greek word is, drum roll please, everybody, buckle your seatbelts, see, I can't even say it right. Anakephaliosis, there I go. Anakephaliosis. If I had it in front of me, I could have done a better job. So kephale in that word, in that Greek word, means head.
Oh, there-
And it also, so head is a summing up or a gathering up into the head of all things. So the key verse for recapitulations is Ephesians 1:10, and you can look that up. God gathers up all things in Christ. The recapitulation idea from Irenaeus is that everything about Jesus' life participates in the atonement. Now, clearly, his death on the cross is the epitome and the climax, but everything, his life of obedience. So Irenaeus says, just giving you a part of the quote, but so my words, by dying on the tree, and that's a reference that he had made previously, he, Christ, undid the disobedience occasioned by the tree. Now, what's that tree?
Tree of the knowledge of good.
Exactly, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Christ's death on the tree undoes the sin occasioned by the tree. So this beautiful kind of full circle, all-encompassing understanding of the work of Christ. So then he says later, thus in this way, Christ gloriously accomplished our salvation and, leaving out part of the quote, dissolved the old disobedience by recapitulating these things in himself in order to obtain life for us. To shorthand it, Christ lived the perfectly obedient life as a human being, filled by the Spirit. He atones for us in this way, and he, remember from the book of Hebrews, he is the pioneer and perfecter of our salvation. So he's showing us the way. He is the way, and he's showing us the way. And we read this passage, this little bit from Hebrews 2 about, conquering death and our fear of death and all that. So now here's a quote from a historical theologian, a historian of theology who is gone on to glory, but is a brilliant, I love reading his stuff. Not easy reading, but it's all there. So Yaroslav Pelikan says this about Irenaeus' view. After the Son's incarnation, he passed through every stage of human growth, hallowing each and redeeming each by, now he does quote from Irenaeus here, being made for them an example of piety, righteousness, and submission. The disobedience of the first Adam was undone through the complete obedience of the second Adam, so that many should be justified and attain salvation. He summed up in himself the entire continuity of the human race and provided humanity, with salvation. So this recapitulation view fits with the others, but it includes Jesus' whole life, right? I love that. Every stage of human growth is covered by the God-man. There's nothing about human life that gets overlooked or left out. Now, that doesn't mean Jesus had to experience every conceivable human experience, but as a representative human, he experienced human experience, truly human. All right, so wrapping up. I think these are good questions to ponder. In salvation, what happens for the believer? You might say on our behalf. What happens to the believer? For example, the believer enters into a new relationship with God. We have a new status or standing with God. We were guilty sinners, guilty of rebellion, sedition, and now we've become citizens and joint heirs with Christ. We become part of the family. These are positional or relational changes. In salvation, what happens in the believer? one of the reasons I'm fascinated with that recapitulation view is what it says about what it implies about sanctification, right?
Yep.
What Christ this in the Spirit does in us, not just for us or to us, right? So ransom is freedom. Penal substitution or judicial or satisfaction is forgiveness, restoration, and recapitulation is a kind of healing of our flesh, of our nature. So we get forgiveness, we get restoration, we get freedom, and we get healing, all in the atoning work of Christ.
Where's
of course-
assurance?
Sorry?
Where is assurance?
It's a good question. Well, my first response is assurance is definitely a byproduct of the atoning work of Christ, right? Assurance comes with the witness of the Spirit. So
Yeah.
when we become Christian, we are baptized by the Spirit into the faith, and we are given assurance at that point that we belong.
Yeah.
So that,
To
is
go.
that for the believer or is that in the
In the
believer?
believer. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, not everything. Yeah, I don't know that
I
you can
guess I'm
categorize
asking,
everything that way.
Is assurance,
Assurance is definitely something that happens in the believer.
Yeah.
The Spirit witnesses with our spirits that we are children of God, right? So it
Yeah.
happens. Go
These
ahead.
questions just reminded me of Wesley's Aldersgate experience, how he had been seeking assurance of salvation all of his life, and then finally he got it, and it just
Right,
came over him.
right. Yep. Okay, well, that's a little taste of how the early church fathers thought of the work of Christ. And what I was really trying to show tonight is they are dealing with these scriptures, right? If you were to read their writings, you would find them referring to these scriptures that we've looked at tonight and many, many others. So they are really past the New Testament age. They are really working now with what we take to be the whole Bible, Genesis to Revelation, and they are doing their best to describe and explain who Christ is and what has he come to do. And as I tried to show a little bit last week, if we get the who Christ is wrong, then the what he came to do starts looking way different too, right? If Jesus is not the God-man, is he some kind of godlike person? Is he an angel? Is he just a great teacher? Well, then is the Christian life, is salvation just believing in his teachings and trying to follow his teachings, or is it more? See, so who he is and what his work is, these really tie together, and they both have a big impact on how we understand the nature of salvation or the Christian life. So now we're going to kind of swing back to the other side of things and start looking at some of the other problems. And, some of this will be a little bit of a repeat from what we did in that class in the fall. We'll look at some of the problems and then how these early church fathers address those problems and why we come up with the faith that we have, the faith once delivered to the saints. And that is it.
Right on time.
Once in a while, I get lucky. All right. We'll see you next week.
everybody.
Okay. Bye.
All right.